Alright, so we just got done discussing in class about figuring out if how we're collecting the data can be representative of the entire population. So this really leads to the idea of what's called bias. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Now, bias is generally a word that you've heard before, so we're going to make sure we understand what that means in a statistical sense, and we'll do the types of bias and give some examples of each of those. So a sample is considered to be biased if the sampling method intends to intentionally, and the intentionally part is important, over or underemphasize a given characteristic of the population that is important to the conclusion. Alright, so let's talk about what we mean. We'll look at a couple of examples of what those are. So first, let's talk about what's called selection bias. And I like a lot of these names as well because they're generally pretty self-explanatory for what the type of bias it actually is. So selection bias is bias that's associated with how the sample is selected. So we're going to look at a couple of examples, but I'm going to be very specific of how I define this to make sure you understand why these are examples of ones that have selection bias. Alright, so let's look at my first example here. Now the first thing I have to know and understand if it's biased or not is I really actually need to know who my population is. So let's suppose my population is all Boone County residents. So that's what I'm interested in studying. And let's suppose I take my sample, I only select non-smokers. Now right then, you might already feel like it's biased. I haven't given you enough information to tell me if that's biased or not. So it really does matter a little bit here of what I'm measuring about these people. Like, what was my goal? So what do I actually want to know from these people? But I also need to know what my variable is. So my variable I'm collecting here is if they approve the idea of a smoking ban. That's an important piece of information for me to figure out why it's biased. So why is this one biased? This goes back to that fundamental rule for using data for inference, right? Because really what I'm asking here is, can non-smokers represent all Boone County residents? And I'll even make sure that these are non-smokers in Boone County, like, right? So they're part of that population. But it matters what I'm measuring. Because again, like if I was looking at the height of people, and I don't think smoking, as long as you did it, of course, when you were older, really affects how tall you turned out to be. It's the fact that I'm looking at if they approve the smoking ban. That's the important part of it here. So why is it biased? Is I truly do believe that your smoking status is going to affect your opinion on the smoking ban. Right? If you were a non-smoker, you probably aren't going to care about a smoking ban. It doesn't affect you. In fact, you're probably going to love it more to not have smoking inside places. Versus if you're a smoker, that's probably going to impact things. So it's the fact of what I'm measuring is also an important part here. Let's look at a second example. And again, I'm going to first start by defining who my population is. I'm going to start with one of the examples we've had before. So I'm going to look at all undergrads at NKU. The sample I have chosen are NKU Math 129 students. Of course, some of you probably never taken Math 129. So Math 129 at NKU's Calculus 1. Just kind of let you know. Alright, so do you feel like Math 129 students could represent all undergraduate students at NKU? Again, matters what I'm measuring. Alright, so what variable am I actually recording about these people? So if I'm interested in their math ACT score, so if I'm interested in math ACT score, do you think Math 129 Calc 1 students could represent all undergraduates at NKU? Okay, probably not. So why? Alright, so generally Calc 1 students will have higher math ACT scores and so that's going to give me biased results. So just don't feel like just another population and sample by itself doesn't tell us if it's biased, right? So we looked at an example of looking at, all people in the United States versus just people in Cincinnati, and depending on what we were measuring, we were okay with it being unbiased in a sense. So you need to know who the goal population is, who your sample is, and what the variable is before you can really tell me if there's a selection bias or not. Now again, this must be intentional. Like, right, I'm only smoking non-smokers. Now, if I have my population being all Boone County residents and I just sample 1,000 people, I could only get non-smokers. But I'm not intentionally making sure I get all non-smokers. So this intentionality part is part of the bias. Alright, so now let's look at the next type of bias, what's called response bias, which is similar to how it's phrased here. So it's bias associated with the questions, actually, or the type of response. So I'll try to give an example of each as we're talking about these. Right, so there's a little bit different way of looking at these setups. So my first example, the first thing you need to know if there's response bias is you need to know what my goal is. So my goal is to figure out what percent of my students, so Dr. Roten's students, like my teaching style. So that's my goal. Right, and right now we're going to assume that I selected my sample in a good way, it's not biased. There can still be a response bias. How could there be a response bias? So here is the question I've decided to ask the students. Or maybe you have decided to ask the students. So if my question says, Dr. Roten is the best. Don't you love her teaching style? I've written that question in a somewhat biased way. So why is that biased? So if you read this question, does it lead to a certain type of response? Right, I'm kind of giving you my opinion here. She's the best. Don't you love her teaching style? With the way that question is phrased, it's leading toward a yes response. So the reason why this is biased because our question is phrased in a leading way. Right, we're kind of leading them to a yes response. That's not a good way for me to ask a question. That would be biased associated with the question. So it's phrased in a bad way to kind of lead to a certain type of response. Let me give you another example. And again, I'm going to start with what my goal is. So maybe I want to figure out what is the mean salary of NKU students 1 year after graduation. That's what I want to know. Here I'm going to figure out how the response could possibly be biased. So the question is just annual salary one year after graduation. That in itself isn't going to be bad. Here's the part that can also make it bad. And maybe I'm asking people over the phone. So I'm calling up people, hey, tell me your annual salary 1 year after graduation. Okay, why might that be biased? When we're talking about money, right, people tend to lie about their salary. Especially if I'm asking them over the phone. Right, I'm not going to actually check up on them, so they can kind of give me any number they want. And when it comes to that certain type of question, how I'm asking it to their face, they're going to have a tendency to lie. So response bias is not only about how the question is phrased, but it's about anything that I'm possibly doing that leads to a certain type of response. So asking it over the phone versus maybe going to their, the place of employment and getting their salary could possibly make me lead to a certain type of bias. And there's lots of different things that we want to ask people about that probably are not best to be asking about, from a face-to-face standpoint. So you can imagine if, at the end of the semester when you're asked to fill out my evaluations as a student, right, you can do that online. There's no handwriting involved that I can decipher handwriting to figure out who you are. So hopefully you have a tendency to be honest. If instead you had to come to me each one-on-one and sit down and have a conversation about me and evaluate me to my face, I'm probably going to get a very different set of responses than I do from that online format. So also how things are administered is also what can lead to a certain type of response bias. All right, our last type of bias that we're going to talk about is called non-response bias. And again, probably stands out about what this is actually going to be, that this is bias associated with either partial or full non-response. First, let me make sure I talk about what I mean by full versus partial. So, for example, if you're given a 20-question survey and you throw the thing away, you're a full non-response. Versus maybe you only leave one of the questions blank, that would be a partial non-response. But here's the first big thing that I want to make sure I emphasize. It's maybe a very confusing thing, but it's an important thing. So a very important note here. Just because we have non-response does not mean that we have a non-response bias. I mean, let's be honest. We've probably all been part of a non-response at some point in our lives. I mean, have you ever gotten a phone call to fill out a 5-minute survey? You didn't do it. You were a non-response. Have you ever got something in the mail and threw it away? You've been part of a non-response. If you ever haven't completed one of your online evaluations for a professor, you have been a non-response. So I know non-response is going to happen. People aren't going to fill out surveys all the time. What I need to worry about is if there's a bias associated with that. And so hopefully I'll make this a little bit more clear in our couple of examples that we're going to look at here. Alright, so my first example. Suppose my goal is I would like to figure out what % of NKU students feel overwhelmed during finals week. So what I do so I'm going to send an email to students with the link. To answer, we'll say maybe a 20-question survey. That includes this question about if they are overwhelmed or not. So we're going to ask them some other things, but we're also going to ask them, maybe like on a scale from 1 to 5, how overwhelmed do you feel during finals week? Okay, great. Now let's talk about who you expect to not respond. Alright, there are some students out there, no matter who they are, they're going to hit delete, right? Some people just don't want to be part of surveys, that's fine. What I need to worry about is if there's a bias. Alright, so when I say talk about a bias, let's talk about being related to what I'm measuring here. So if I'm trying to figure out how overwhelmed you are, who is not going to fill out that survey? So why is it biased? Alright, those who are feeling overwhelmed, right, you feel like you don't have a ton of time already as it is, you're feeling like you're going crazy. They're the ones that are going to be less likely to respond. So then when I actually look at my data, it's like, oh, students aren't feeling very overwhelmed. Well, why does that seem to be? Because those who were feeling overwhelmed didn't take the time to fill out the survey because they were feeling overwhelmed. Right, there's that intentionality of that missing group, this bias that's related to the question by who is not responding. Does that make sense? Let's look at a second example to see if it does. Let's first talk about my goal. I'm going to determine what % of able U.S. citizens are registered to vote. That's what I would like to know. So I'm going to take my sample and I'll make sure I take it across the United States so I don't have like a region thing going on. And I'll make sure they are of eligible voters, so making sure that they are part of my population. we're going to ask them if they are registered to vote. And maybe some other information, right? All right. How could that lead to a bias from those who are not going to respond? Is there a certain group related to being registered to vote that are either more or less likely to respond to this survey? I guess I think those who aren't registered to vote maybe don't want to admit it. Right, the bar those that aren't registered to vote will be less likely to respond. Just kind of throwing in a third example here, because this is one that happens a lot, right? So when it comes to teaching evaluations of professors, we of course have a huge amount of non-response. And what I always need to worry about is if there's a bias there. And I actually know that there's a bias when it comes to reading my evaluations. Usually the group that doesn't respond, which may seem a little strange, are those that are really in the middle. There are some professors you probably love, there probably been some that you really hated, right? And if you really have a strong opinion about the professor, you're much more likely to fill that out. So you have a tendency to see the extremes when it comes to me reading my evaluations, where a lot of the students who are kind of like the average of how they think about me are actually less likely to respond. And that's actually still a group that I really would like to know about, because they're the ones that didn't have a strong opinion. What did they think was good? What they think was not good? So I could change them from being about me to hopefully enjoying my class. So I have a tendency to be missing that middle group when it comes to evaluations, for example. But the important thing I want you to remember about bias is that, remember, there's this intentionality. So when it comes to selection bias and response bias, there's an intentionality of how we're doing something that's going to lead to certain results. When there's a non-response bias, we need to make sure we understand that just because people aren't always going to fill it out, doesn't mean that it's always biased. Right? I need to know if there's a certain group that I know isn't going to take the time to fill something out for me. That's related to the question I'm really trying to measure. Like, right, if I'm sending out a survey to NKU students, and I want to figure out, what their height is, I don't think that only short people are not going to respond, or that only tall people are not going to respond. Right? I probably feel perfectly good about some people not filling that out and still feeling pretty good about the results that I get. So again, just because people aren't going to fill it out does not mean that it's biased. So we need to have this reasoning behind it.